Today, we're going to talk about the most prolific serial killer in the history of the United States. But honestly, this isn't really a story about him. It's an explainer that gets at a much more chilling question. Who do we, as a society, allow to become invisible?
93. Just let that number sink in for a second. That's how many women the FBI has confirmed Samuel Little murdered. 93 separate lives, gone. A number so huge, it's almost impossible to wrap your head around, and it forces us to ask a really critical question.
So, how in the world did this happen? How did one guy get away with this for decades, across so many different states? Well, the answer isn't what you've seen in the movies. This is not some story about a criminal mastermind. It's actually a story about systemic failure and our own collective blind spots.
To really get how Little operated, we first have to understand how he basically became a ghost, just moving through the country, completely unseen by the very systems that are supposed to find people exactly like him.
You know, this just completely dismantles that typical serial killer myth we all have in our heads. We picture these sophisticated, charming, brilliant monsters. But the reality of Samuel Little, it was way more mundane. And frankly, a lot more disturbing. He wasn't some genius. He just used brute physical strength. He wasn't all that cunning. He was just constantly on the move, never staying in one place for long. And he wasn't some deceptive charmer. He was simply overlooked. People consistently underestimated him.
At the end of the day, his entire method, his so-called success, was built on one simple, horrifying foundation. Nobody was really looking for him because almost no one was looking for his victims. And that right there brings us to the absolute heart of this story. The real tragedy here isn't the killer himself. It's the lives that were stolen and the systemic indifference that let it happen again and again and again.
So who were the women Samuel Little targeted? Well, they were almost exclusively women living on the fringes, on the absolute margins of society. A lot of them were involved in sex work, many were battling addiction, some were homeless. They often didn't have those strong family or social safety nets that so many of us just take for granted. And you have to understand, these were not random choices. He preyed on their specific vulnerabilities, knowing full well they were less likely to be missed.
This quote from the source material it's just devastatingly clear. Because of their life circumstances, their deaths weren't even investigated as homicides most of the time. The violence done to them was just erased, chalked up to something else, and explained away.
Think about that. The bias against these women was so deeply ingrained that their actual murders were rendered invisible. Because their lives lacked a certain kind of social power, their deaths just didn't trigger the kind of sustained investigation or media outcry that could have stopped Little decades earlier.
Okay, so let's zoom out now and look at the bigger picture here. This wasn't just about individual people being biased. This was about a whole system that was just full of gaps. Gaps that Little walked right through for decades.
I mean, just look at this timeline. It's just one missed opportunity after another. In the 70s, he starts killing. Through the 80s and 90s, he gets arrested multiple times for things like assault. But because law enforcement was so fragmented between different states, nobody is connecting the dots. He just moves on, gets picked up for something else somewhere new, and the deadly pattern stays completely hidden. This goes on all the way into the 2000s.
And a huge piece of the puzzle was just bureaucratic and technological. Before we had modern coordinated data systems, every police department was basically its own little island. An arrest in Florida meant absolutely nothing to a detective in Ohio. So every time Little had a run-in with the law, it was seen as a single, isolated incident, not as one more point in a terrifying nationwide pattern.
So after all that, after decades of evading justice, you'd think some brilliant detective work finally cracked the case, right? Nope. What finally stopped him wasn't some big investigation connecting all the cases. It was a single DNA match from a cold case all the way in 2012. It was science, not systemic awareness, that finally put an end to his rampage.
So what are we supposed to take away from this absolutely horrifying story? What is the real legacy of the Samuel Little case? Well, it's a lesson that we all learned far too late.
The legacy is this idea, right here. Permission by neglect. This isn't about some mythic evil bogeyman. It's a stark, painful lesson in what happens when our collective failure to care about certain lives, when the simple absence of attention effectively gives permission for violence to grow and thrive in the shadows. This whole case, it really serves as a powerful and deeply uncomfortable mirror for all of us. It forces us to confront a really fundamental question about justice and fairness. Which victims get our attention? Whose stories get told and investigated?
and whose are just dismissed, ignored, and allowed to disappear. And that brings us to the final and most crucial question this case leaves us with. Samuel Little is gone, but are the conditions that allowed him to operate, the biases, the systemic gaps, the neglect of marginalized people, are they really gone? Whose safety are we still overlooking today? Who are the invisible victims now?